Now, I'm pleased to present our second plenary session. EENA staff members will explore emerging trends in the electronic communication sector and how these trends, coupled with recent changes to the EU regulatory framework for emergency communications, will shape the future to ensure that emergency communication systems are effective and reliable in times of crisis. Just what we heard. I'm pleased to welcome to the stage Cristina Lumbreras, EENA's Technical Director, Benoit Vivier, EENA's Public Affairs Director, and Freddie McBride, EENA's Director of Digital Communications Policy and Regulation. Take it away, guys.
Well, good morning, everybody. We have heard about the terrible events that happened in Turkey and Syria. Thank you, Zeynep. Thank you, Turhan, for sharing with us all the work that you have done. We have seen how emergency services have tried to help as much as possible all the citizens. And well, I will take the last sentence of the presentation about the hope in the future, and this is why we are here, to speak about the future of emergency services and to make them work better. So the title of this presentation is Towards a New Era in Emergency Communications and Response. And this is quite impressive, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed, the word new era can actually sound quite strong, but to be honest, I don't think it is, because of course there's what we see, the technology changes, but there's much more than that, than just the technology change. It's only a small part of it. We also see that, for instance, the expectations from the citizens are also getting bigger. So these expectations are, for instance, in the way to reach out to the emergency services, but also in terms of expectations when it comes to data that we're supposed to provide to emergency services, also in terms of quality of service simply. Besides that, there's also new legislative requirements that PSAPs have to deal with, having also to deal with their own numerous internal constraints. So there's actually many things that are affecting emergency communications nowadays, and that's why I think we're really at the dawn of a new era, I think. And I think it's good to have time today to reflect together on these changes.
Indeed, Benoit. And let's take you through these drivers one at a time this morning. So digital transformation of society, it pervades everything we do now, every corner of the economy and society. And of course, digital transformation is underpinned and enabled by electronic communications networks and services. If we look here on the screen at the end user domain, we see device and service innovation that drives end user demand for new digital products and services. And of course, that demand stimulates investment in networks, greater capacity, greater coverage, greater speed. But they're not the only drivers. There's a green agenda, the need to reduce telecoms emissions. There's a need to use the radio spectrum more efficiently. And also, there's the need to reduce the cost of legacy support. So taking all of that into account, the PSAPs and the emergency services need to respond to these changes. They need to be able to receive and process emergency communications, and increasingly all the data that comes with them, no matter what device, service, or network they originate on. And indeed, this is a migration process. It's about the progressive replacement of legacy, but not just technologies. If you really want to maximize the benefits of the technologies, you have to look at your operational processes and procedures too. And that requires investment in people as well. So, and of course, other strategic considerations here are the need to ensure continuity of emergency communications right through the migration process. So if we, I started talking there about end user demand, but what about end user expectations from emergency communications, Cristina?
So, well, we are not communicating today so much via voice with our friends and family, and well, even at work. So we used to have video calls, so we text a lot. All the communication is based on many apps that we have. And maybe the expectations of the citizens is that they could eventually also contact emergency services using these ways. But it's not only this way on how to contact emergency services, but it's all about the user experience. So we expect that when we contact emergency services, they will have directly some data, for example, the location, that we don't have to speak with many people and say again the same, I'm here, I have this terrible situation. So, and also when I can imagine a person waiting for an ambulance, this person is really stressed, so it would be really good to have this feedback. When is the ambulance coming? Can I do something? This is something that would be, I think, expected by the citizens. Mm. But for this, of course, I think we need like a legal framework.
Yeah, and here the role of the legislation is really to echo the citizens' expectations and to embrace the technology changes. So we really have a combination of this. And we saw actually, I guess all of you can witness recently, some new requirements on emergency communications. And actually the first thing is that we no longer speak about an emergency call, it's an emergency communication. That's quite a change, and that is made so that to include more ways to contact the emergency services. For instance, for people with disabilities also, to enjoy access with an equivalent manner. And that comes with a whole new set of other requirements, such as on caller location, for instance. A new addition also that we saw recently is contextual data. Contextual data is basically what helps the call taker to better determine and assess the nature of the emergency. So that is something which I think we will speak about that more and more times in future events. Freddie, you were also mentioning technology changes and the digital transformation. I think it's important here to make sure that we're not left aside this trend, but that we can rather benefit from these technology changes. So this is why the European Commission recently required from public authorities to produce roadmaps on the transition to newer generation of networks, that basically to embrace this change. And here I was talking only about people dialing 112, I can say, but there's many other legislation which also have impacts on our sector. One of them, for instance, is public warning. Of course, we had a new legislation a few years ago to allow public authorities to warn all of us here in Europe on our phones, so that's something we have in mind. We also have in mind eCall, of course, and there are talks actually about the new legislation on transitioning to newer generation of networks.
Indeed, and the fourth driver we'll talk about this morning is the need for operational excellence in PSAPs. And why do we need operational excellence? Well, if we think about the realities that we have today, emergency contacts continue to rise. The number of channels into the emergency services continues to rise, and this increased activity, of course, puts pressure on current operations. There's a need to consolidate operations, and of course, we operate in an environment where there's quite often budget constraints. And indeed, and I'd refer back to Dimitri's presentation this morning when he talked about the staffing challenges. And at an operational level, the recruitment and retention of staff in PSAPs and emergency services has never been more challenging. So let's take a look at how these four drivers impact on the emergency communication supply chain. So if you look here, we start with a citizen at the top of this circle, if you like. And with the right application of innovative technology, of dedicated and well-trained people, and efficient processes, we can work through that chain and get the right help where it's needed in the shortest possible amount of time. And that's really the purpose of looking at these drivers and how we can improve this process entirely. So let's start at the top of the chain, and we'll take a journey through it. And let's start with the citizen.
So now we are a person, and we are in an emergency situation, and we need to call for help. So the first step, of course, would be to know what is the emergency number to be dialed and how to access emergency services. This person may be in a well-known place or not. This person may be alone. This person may be very, very stressed. So it's very difficult. It's a very difficult situation, and this person cannot start Googling and saying what is the number. And in the EU we have 112, but how well it's 112 implemented?
So 112 is available now in over 50 countries worldwide. The EU legislation requires its availability 24/7, free of charge, and anywhere in the European Union. But I just mentioned 50 countries, so of course it's the European Union, but it goes much beyond that, and sometimes even outside of Europe, it's also an emergency number. So we can really say that it's now recognized as a global emergency number. It's actually, if you look back in time, I think it's important we start to have that thought that only 30 years ago, that's really not much, it was only a project, and now it's really widely used. I checked the figures from last year. Out of the 270 million emergency calls made every year, 153 million of them were calls to 112. So that's really well used nowadays. So we can really call this project a success.
Okay, now it's well implemented, but we were talking about awareness. Do you know how well known is it?
Yeah, I think it's indeed very important to have a look at that. According to a recent Eurobarometer survey, 74% of Europeans would call that number if they face an emergency in their country. So we can say that this number is quite well known in most European countries.
Yeah, but when we look at this slide, this is about knowing the emergency number in your own country, but surely the benefit of a number like 112 is that you're aware that you can use it outside of your own country.
Yeah, and that's indeed something that is very important to have in mind. And if we look at the same map and the same study, but with knowledge of 112 is the European emergency number, it's really not as good. As we can see, 41% of Europeans only would call 112 if they face an emergency in another European country. So to be honest, it's really a disappointing figure. It's not really well known, and we can see that from this map, we can see that in basically every European country, there are awareness campaigns to be done to really insist on the European dimension of this number.
Okay, we have spoken now about the awareness, but there's also to know how to contact emergency services. And we see that in many countries it's different. So in some countries there's only voice. In other countries you can text SMS you can put an SMS to 112. In other countries or even regions there's a specific app. So it's always difficult to know how this can be done. And it's even more difficult for hearing impaired people because this really differs from country to country, even from region in some countries. And you need to pre-register in some countries, not in all, but that means that the person traveling has to think about it. In some countries you have an app that this person has to download, and in other countries there's a specific number. So this is not easy at all. There's some, in the framework of the roaming legislation, there will be a requirement into entering now in June that will communicate, or that will include in the SMS of welcome when you come to arrive to a country and you receive this welcome message. There will be information about how to access emergency services. Okay, and well, we know the number, we know how to contact, but without a device, it will be only smoke signals. So we need really a device. Well, there are a lot of devices to make things easy. There are only two categories: automatic triggering and manual triggering. So we know that from manual triggering, there's always a person behind. People sometimes they don't behave very well, so we all know that there are a lot of false emergency calls at the PSAPs, and we were very hoping that automatic triggering devices would just work super well and there will not be any false calls. Well, the first example is eCall, that it has been a revolution for the PSAPs. It's really the first time PSAPs are receiving automatically data, what is called the minimum set of data. There are still challenges on this implementation. One of them, of course, the false emergency calls, and also the technology. So the technology today is based on an in-band modem, and it's needed to go to a next generation e-call. But I will not spoil the next generation e-call, the session that we will have tomorrow. And not only e-call can be based on 112, but it can also be a private e-call, what we call third-party service providers, so that the call is received via an emergency call center, but from a private company. And in case it's a real emergency, the information of these incidents is transferred to the PSAP. I'm spoiling again another session on TPSPs, so I will stop here. And for them, of course, it will be really difficult to know what number they should dial, because sometimes the accident is not in the same country as the call center. So this would mean that we will have to speak again about the awareness of emergency number, but I will not come back, otherwise we will never end this presentation.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recall here, Cristina, you were talking about the devices available, but the ones we use the most nowadays to contact the emergency services is the smartphones, and this has led to many improvements, for instance, on caller location. I remember a few years ago, I don't remember when it was, when AML was first presented at the EENA conference, it almost sounded like a utopia. And then over the years, we've been showing that map with more and more countries on the map to arrive where we are today, and now it's used in most Europe, we can say.
Yeah, and indeed, if I remember well, it was the UK and Estonia that implemented AML first. I think that was 2016. Yeah. And fast forward 7 years, and as you say, Benoit, looking at this map, the progress does look very, very, very good indeed. But there are still some issues to be resolved, aren't there?
Absolutely, there are some issues that are still to be addressed. The first one, for instance, is roaming. In general, there's little talks about it, though I think it's one very important use case that, you have visitors coming to one country, they call 112, they can't describe the location because they're not really familiar with the area. And I'm not going to lie, it's quite hard to implement technologically AML for visiting roamers. But there are ways to make it happen. It is already available in some European countries, so it is really possible, and I think it's really important to insist here in the room for public authorities who are in the room to work on making that happen, to work together with the OS developers and with the national mobile network operators to make this possible in their country. Another important issue to be addressed with AML is what we call the error rates. We see in many countries some errors in the transmission of AML. So depending on the countries, it goes from 20 to 50% of error rate. So that means that, to see the glass half full, also that in 50 to 80% of emergency communications, they come with an AML location. But for the rest, there are some error rates which are due to the accumulation of many factors, actually. So it's very important to break down these error rates, to look at the roots of them, and to basically to address what needs to be addressed with the relevant stakeholders. And finally, one last point, it's less of an operational issue, but it's something that is coming. It's a new legislation which requires public authorities in the member states to produce caller location requirements or caller location criteria. So it looks basically like X% of emergency communications should come with a location within X meters. So there's a lot of work to do on that from the national regulatory authorities. But I know EENA is also working on producing some recommendations, and we'll be speaking about that later this morning, actually.
So if you want to know more about all these topics that we have mentioned, we have highlighted here some of the sessions. So the first one will be right after this presentation, after the coffee break. It will be here. It's how to address future challenges on caller location. Then tomorrow we will speak also in this room about implementing real-time text in the framework of the European Accessibility Act. and in the afternoon about the convenience of emergency communications to PSAPs via TPSPs. And right after this one, we will have the next generation e-call also here in this room at 3 p.m.
Okay, let's move along our journey around the emergency communication supply chain, and we'll talk about network access. You talked about devices, very powerful devices. They're no good if you don't have a network. But first, let's look at in total, the breakdown of emergency communications we've been getting in PSAPs over the last number of years, and look at some of the trends that we're seeing there. So, fixed line contacts, fixed line voice contacts in decline. Mobile originated emergency communications on the up, of course. Indeed, some European countries now, like Finland, over 90% of all contacts to emergency services are mobile originated. We have coverage gaps in mobile filled with voice over Wi-Fi, and more recently through innovative solutions that use satellite networks. And then there's also the over-the-top access into the PSAPs using apps, and of course apps need either mobile broadband or fixed broadband to work. But the big challenge in networks at the moment is the shutting down of 2G and 3G services and the transition to 4G and 5G services. So if we look at 2G and 3G first, one of the big changes we'll see is this removal of circuit switched fallback. And for those of you who may not know what it is, emergency services in Europe, emergency communications I should say, relies on circuit switch networks. And that's the way it is in almost all countries. So even if you have a 4G voice service, when you dial 112, you deregister from the 4G network, and you're supposed to re-register onto 2G and 3G to complete the call. The motivation for that, of course, looking back, was that the coverage, geographic coverage you get from 2G and 3G was a lot better than 4G and 5G when it was rolled out. And indeed, the equivalent levels of coverage when we do transition are really important. The earlier generations of mobile network, when the spectrum licenses were issued, the requirements were about geographic coverage. And when 4G came along, the spectrum license requirements were more about population coverage. But of course, in emergency communications, those cases that we see that make the headlines, somebody rescued from a mountain or rescued in a boat at sea or something like that, that requires geographic coverage. And we really do need to have equivalent levels as we transition to 4G and 5G. And then there's the issue with the citizen. And the time will come when we need to make the citizen aware that the devices they're using on 2G and 3G networks will no longer work. And at an appropriate time, there has to be a solid communications campaign in each country to make sure the citizens know when they need to upgrade their devices. So moving on to 4G and 5G rollout. It brings lots of benefits, of course. Voice over LTE. It's based on packet switch technologies. So we have multimedia emergency communications, which are really important, particularly for equivalence. But there's one major issue that we need to resolve, and we will be touching upon it later in the conference, and that's the compatibility and interoperability issues that we've seen between devices and networks. We cannot turn 2G and 3G completely off until these issues are resolved, and work is ongoing at the moment to resolve them. Then we've got security. We need to ensure that the security of our devices and our networks and services is maintained, and also all of the data that passes along the different domains of the chain. And network resilience, I don't think I need to say anything. We saw the presentation this morning from Turkey where networks were down when they were needed. So network resilience is really important. And I mention this again, I'll probably mention it 10 times in the presentation this morning. We're in this migration process, and continuity of emergency communications through that migration process is key.
Yeah, and we'll be speaking more about that during the conference, during these 3 days. I'm going to move a bit, actually, since we have a big stage. So we have several sessions on this. We have, tomorrow morning in this room, we have a session on answering seamless emergency communications during 2G, 3G shutdown. You briefly touched upon this, Freddie. We have a full hour to discuss this. And since it's also important to look in the future, we'll also have a session here on, when is it, Friday morning, on transitioning to packet switch technologies to look at a newer generation of network. And since it's also important to, as you say, to ensure always emergency communications, when the networks are not available, we also have the satellites. So we'll have a session just above me on ensuring the continuity of emergency communication and public warning with satellite applications. So that's also tomorrow at 9, so we'll all have to split a bit between the sessions, but that session will be important as well.
Okay, let's continue our journey to the reception of available call taker at the PSAP. So before that, the call has to be routed, and it has to be routed to the most appropriate PSAP. So it has to be well routed. This can be done by the network, but it can also be done by the PSAP domain on what we call NG112. NG112, I think it's a classic topic of this conference. Well, I don't know if it's classic or trendy, because, I think its momentum has come. And just to remind you what is NG112, it's really to have and ensure end-to-end IP-based communications to make possible multimedia and enriched communication between the citizen and the authority. But it's not only about this, it enables the interconnections of emergency services. And also we have mentioned the routing part, so that it can be done using multiple parameters. So it's being today implementing around the world. So I think we can decide that it's actually a trendy topic. But it's also about migrating to IP, isn't it, Freddie?
It is about migrating to IP, or packet switch technologies, as the legislation Benoit referred to mentions. I think one of the big benefits of NG112, though, in that migration, and again, we talk about ensuring continuity through the migration process, is the way the NG112 architecture is defined. It can support emergency communications originating on legacy networks and next generation networks at the same time, and it can also support next generation PSAPs and also legacy PSAPs at the same time. So it gives you that assurance that we will have continuity through that transformation process. Benoit mentioned, when he spoke about the legislation, the requirement that member states have now in the delegated regulation to submit roadmaps to the European Commission on their plans to upgrade their PSAPs to packet switched technologies. And actually, the deadline for those roadmaps is the 5th of December this year. So that's less than 8 months from now. So member state authorities should be, very focused on preparing those roadmaps at the moment. And it's an opportune time for us to promote our NG112 education program. If any of you would like to have a session with us to discuss transitioning to packet switch technologies, using the NG112 architecture, we'd be very happy to hear from you, and Cristina and I would be happy to facilitate a session with you and stakeholders in your countries to prepare those roadmaps.
Yeah, but NG112 is not only just a thing of regulators to produce roadmaps. It has also concrete benefits for the PSAPs, and I think it's really important to stress on these. And as we're talking here in our journey on the reception of the call now, for instance, a very concrete benefit of NG112 is to be able to optimize, I would say, the emergency call management. So basically, when you have a peak of emergency calls in one PSAP, you can divert some of them, transfer them quite easily, I can say easily, I guess, to another PSAP, so that it will help to better absorb the flow, the peak of emergency calls. And so that's one part of it. But when we think about the new trends in emergency communications reception, we can see many different things changing. One of them, for instance, is IVR, Interactive Voice Response Systems. We're starting to see that in a few European countries. It's quite interesting. So it can be used for in different manners. So one of them can be to filter the emergency calls, but it can also be used to to better absorb the peak of emergency calls or just to reduce the number of false calls. So that's many possible uses that can be done. Should it really be used for all emergency calls? That's a question. We'll have actually speakers tomorrow in one session who will be explaining actually their implementation and how they use it. So it would be quite exciting to hear about their feedback from that. Another trend, I cannot not mention it if we speak about the reception of a call, a new trend is, of course, artificial intelligence. And actually one big question that we will have to be reflecting on in the next years even is what space we should give to AI in emergency communications reception. Of course, I don't have the answer today, but you know what? Let's be a bit provocative and ask, like, will it one day replace the call takers? That's a question. I of course, don't have the answer. It's a bit early, but it should not prevent us from already thinking about integrating some components of it in our operations and start benefiting from it. And I hear very often, actually now, about the use, for instance, of chatbots, especially for non-emergencies. It is something that we're starting to see. And here I just covered some technology changes, but of course, it's basically technology responses to all the problems. And there are some problems that have been around for ages and that we will still see for the many years to come. One of them, for instance, is false calls. It's still a very big issue in many PSAPs. It's hard to estimate exactly how many false calls we see to emergency services. It's around 40%, let's say, in Europe. So 40% of emergency calls are not real emergencies. So there are ways to limit that, of course, not to eliminate it completely, but I think it's very important to mention that today and to keep that as an objective from the PSAP, but also from the phone manufacturers, for instance, from the MNOs, to keep that objective in mind, basically to reduce false calls.
Indeed, and you may have noticed I took my phone out there when Benoit was talking. It's not because I'm getting bored, it's because I find it easier to announce the next sessions off my phone. So Benoit mentioned interactive voice response. We will have a session on that tomorrow morning at 10:05. That'll take place in the Cosevel Hall. And then this, I suppose, somewhat controversial topic of the role of artificial intelligence. Tomorrow also in the STI Hall at 3:05 p.m. we will have a masterclass on chatbots and artificial intelligence. And if you're interested in the NG112 discussions, we will have a next generation progress update that'll take place here this afternoon at 3:05 p.m. And we'll hear about the progress on the implementation projects for NG112 in Switzerland, North Macedonia, and Portugal. And then tomorrow, we will have an international perspective on next generation implementation and operation. That will be here also in the Gallas Hall at 11:30 a.m. And last but not least, I mentioned the requirement for submitting your roadmaps to the European Commission. Tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. in the STI Hall, we will have a representative from the European Commission here. And this is your opportunity to go to that session and put your questions to the Commission directly to get guidance on interpreting and implementing the delegated regulation.
Okay, finally the call has arrived to the PSAP, and now the person that is in an emergency situation is speaking with the call taker. These are people, of course, working in the PSAP. These two tasks, the data collection and the classification of the emergency situation, are very stressful tasks to be done. So it's really important that we take care of these people, that there's a positive organizational culture is set up in the PSAP, that these people are also considered in this migration to the new era of emergency communications and rescue, and that we don't neglect the impact that this change can have on the PSAP. So call takers are really in touch with the citizen. They are the ones that are, let's say, in the front line, and they have to deal with these expectations of the citizens. What are those expectations, Freddie?
Well, you mentioned earlier, Cristina, the expectation that when somebody calls emergency services, and explains their situation, what the emergency incident is, that they only do it once. So that's one. And then the expectation they have from the emergency response teams is that the help that they need arrives quickly. So this is important. And indeed, one of the issues in getting help to the citizen quickly that needs to be done is to be able to classify the emergency situation swiftly. And the data that we collect, both in the interview from the caller and automatically, so for an e-call, the minimum set of data or the location we get from devices and networks, is really, really important, because then we can look at all that data. We can validate it based on, automatically provided data versus data received in the interview with the caller. That allows us to classify the emergency situation quickly, and then, hopefully get help quickly. Now, Benoit, when he talked about the legislation earlier this morning, he introduced this this concept that was introduced in the legislation of contextual data. So Benoit, maybe you could share with us what contextual data entails.
Yeah. I'm a bit far from you, so I will move closer.
Get binoculars out here.
So yeah, contextual data is basically all the data which will help the call taker to better assess the emergency situation, so determine the nature of the emergency, the gravity, the location of the person making the communication, the medical condition also of the victim. So all this data which is useful to the call taker and will be even more useful in the years to come. So there's many of such data in different types. You have the data that is coming with the emergency communication, and here we'll just focus on a few projects or new things that we are seeing. For instance, we are seeing that in some PSAPs, in some countries, we see some projects to basically bring data about the, let's say, pre-registered medical condition of the patient, so that they will put before on their phone, and this information will be carried directly to the PSAP when they contact the emergency services. So it's a project we're starting to see. We're also starting to see now some PSAPs receiving information about the language spoken by the person making the emergency communication, or at least the language of the handset. So this is something that we start to see in the PSAPs. And we mentioned other types of emergency communications. Some of them already come with actually a set of minimal set of data, actually. So there's already all this contextual data, which is useful to the call taker. We also have some data that now we start to see in the PSAPs software that are being used. So for instance, now when we see the CAD system and the GIS systems a bit everywhere, they're getting richer and richer with information. So here are just a few of them. Of course, at EENA, we like to speak about AD mapping, so we start to see that now in the mapping system of the call takers. But we're also seeing now the modelization, the 3D modelization of buildings, which is something that can be useful for the call taker to prepare the intervention. And we're also seeing some the data derived from the sensors, which is also something that can be helpful. And finally, there's also some data that can be here from, let's say, from the past about the background of the caller, of the person making the person making the emergency communication, basically about the registered like medical condition, etc. So information collected from previous call, which can be still useful in today's situation. So this is some type of data that we are starting to see.
And if you want to learn more about data, there's a session today at 11:50 in the Stee Hall on what data do you need to see. I suppose the filtering that Benoit talked about. AED mapping, you'll have to make a choice here. There's a session on that also at 11:50 in the Kosovel Hall, so choose your weapons. Then we have, in relation to classifying emergency calls, we have a session this afternoon at 2 p.m. in the Kosovel Hall on defining call takers' question tree, which is really, really important to process within the PSAPs. And going back to what Cristina was talking about in terms of people in the PSAP, we have two really, really interesting sessions. Remember the word cloud this morning, staffing. You know, this was really, really, it's really a challenge at the moment. And we have a session on the Great Resignation. That's today at 3:05 in the Kosovel Hall. And on Friday morning in the closing plenary, we have a very interesting session at 9:40 on protecting the emotional and psychological well-being of PSAP employees.
Okay, so we are arriving now to the final part of this chain. There are the two last steps that are the dispatch of the appropriate resources and the intervention, rescue, and care. So now the situation has been classified, and depending on how the organization of the emergency communication supply chain is organized in each country, it's the moment where the PSAP sends the information to the emergency services organizations. So in some places, this is still done by voice. So the PSAP call taker just reads what is in his or her screen and tell the emergency services organizations where the incident is. Of course, in this new era, this cannot happen anymore, so we really think that the communication should be based on data, that the data transmission should be a reality everywhere, and for this, we are also aware that the standardization efforts need to be done, because today each emergency service organization has a different system, a different technological platform, and they are not communicated, or there's no bridges between them. So this is something that we need to work on.
Indeed, Cristina. And actually, when we talk about emergency communications and the application of technology, we focus a lot on that part from the caller to the PSAP, you know, getting the call in, classifying it, getting the data. But that data is equally useful, in fact, probably more useful to the emergency response teams. It's important that it's provided in a digital format to the emergency responders. I mean, if you put yourselves in their shoes, they have to make split-second decisions in very challenging circumstances. So the availability of the digital data to complement mission-critical communications is really, really important. Helps them to work smarter, helps them to work safer. And of course, when we talk about mission-critical, we talked about network resilience earlier. We need those networks to be reliable. We need them to be redundant and secure, and of course, interoperable. And this discussion about transitioning to packet switch technologies, equally applies to mission-critical communications as it does to electronic communications or emergency communications in general.
And you know what? We'll speak about that more during the event. We have more sessions on these topics which have just been discussed. So we'll have a session tomorrow, end of the morning at 11:30, about exchange of data between emergency services organizations, to follow up on what you said, Cristina. Then we'll move in the afternoon. After lunch at 3:05 in the Lynott Hall, we'll have a session on additional data in emergency communications management. And right after a coffee also, because it's needed in the afternoon, at 4:30 in that room, we'll discuss actually, Freddie, what you just said, the new era of mission-critical communications.
Okay, so we haven't finished, so we have now the public warning chain. So we will change the perspective. We have covered the communication from citizen to authority, and now we will cover the one on authorities to citizen. So everything starts with an event, usually a very big tragic event that is happening in a country, or it's a predicted event. It can be also smaller events like a fire. The authorities are alerted, and they have to take the decision to launch a public warning system or not. So this, of course, is not an easy decision to be taken. And before that, all the technology has to be set up and well tested, so to make sure that it is available in the moment it's needed. And once this public warning channels infrastructure is used, the people in the area are alerted. And what are the technologies that are available today? And there's an obligation for EU member states to implement a public warning system based on mobile phones, so that the that the message is received in our devices, and this can be achieved by cell broadcast or location-based SMS, but there are different channels. There are different channels that are sirens. It could be also social media, but of course, this technology needs to be efficiently and effectively used, and for this, of course, a strategy is needed.
Yeah, as you said, Cristina, you described the technology, but what is even more important is how you're going to use this, because basically when something happens, you don't have time to think, so it's very important to define in advance what technologies you're going to use, by which authorities, in what circumstances, to what area, etc. So it's all of things that you have to think in advance and to prepare in advance, of course. What is important, we have the technologies, you described them. It's important to use as many channels as possible because we have we have population with different people, different practices, different needs, etc. So to reach out to as many people as possible, it's important to use as many channels as possible. However, one challenge that comes when you use many different channels is to keep a consistent message. It's really important to have that one single message communicated with the population, so that's also part of the strategy. Because in the end, what really matters is that the citizens, actually everyone, will receive the message and will understand the message. That's very important, because in the end, what you want is that the citizen is informed about the danger and will do what they're instructed to do. So that's really part of this strategy definition, I think.
All right, and if you want to know more about public warning, we have a session here today at 2 p.m. On public warning implementation in France. Tomorrow at 10:05 a.m. in the Linhart Hall, we'll be talking about the diversification of public warning channels. On day 3 at 9 a.m. in the closing plenary, we'll be talking about communication technology and public trust in the future of emergency response. And also in the closing plenary on Friday morning at 10:50 a.m., we will be hearing from the International Telecommunications Union on the UN Early Warnings for All Action Plan.
Okay, so now we have seen both chain. We have also understood there are still challenges to be faced. There's still work to be done. And well, this is why we are here. This is why the EENA conference exists.
Yes, so we're nearly there. We won't keep you from your coffee for too much longer. It's probably a good time to remind everybody of what our mission is. It's to improve the safety and security of the people. And I hope that the presentation here this morning give you some insights into the scope of our activities and how we, try to ensure that those activities are addressed in our conference program this week. Usually an organization presents its mission statement on slide 1 or slide 2. We thought it was appropriate here. And the reason for that is because the EENA as an organizational entity is 12 people. But the EENA community is very large, and it's all of you. So we'd like to finish our presentation by saying, let's work together to improve the safety and security of the people.
But everything starts with a coffee. I think I speak on behalf of everybody.